r/AskReddit. Y2K was 20 years ago. What are your best Y2K stories? I was managing the IT department in a state agency, and were under enormous pressure to prevent any Y2K problems. On NY Day I went to work before dawn, and tested everything before the exec director arrived. Relieved that everything was working okay, we went to IHOP for a celebratory breakfast. The IHOP bill was date-timed, stamped 32 1999. I would have framed that receipt. What does testing for Y2K look like? Did you just manually change the date to January 1st, 2000 and see if it broke anything? My favorite thing was cemetery headstones that were not Y2K compliant. People had headstones made before they died with the 19 pre-engraved, planning on filling in the next 2 digits when the time came. Oops, they kept living. OMG, I forgot about stuff like that. I had order forms at work. I had to scribble out the 19 _ on until we ran out. In the Indiana University Cemetery there is a headstone with the death date 20 _ engraved on it, then crossed out. Below it is a date in November 1999, followed by the words, "She was an optimist." I think my favorite story I heard about actually happened before 2000, but it was basically the same idea. It was about someone in a northern European country who had turned 105, born in like 1890, receiving a letter in the mail addressed to parents of and his name. The letter was telling his parents that he was supposed to start school now that he was 5 years old. Of course, this happened because the government used a 2-digit date in the computer system and sent a letter to everyone with a 90 birth year. It used to be that every 6-year-old in Iceland got sent a letter from traffic school with books and stuff to teach them how to cross the road and things like that. There were also 106-year-olds that got this. I lived overseas and was watching the news with family and friends on the Armed Forces Network. The newscast did the countdown and then they cut the feed and it went to static. There were several gasps and then about 5 seconds later the feed came back and the newscast shouted, "Just kidding. Happy New Year." Quote, I thought it was pretty clever. I was at a big house party and the owner's GF at the time threw the main breaker to the house at midnight. Since this was out of town and back in the woods a bit, this resulted in almost total darkness and quiet except for the stars and critters and everyone freaking out a little bit. She flipped it back on after about 5 to 10 Monsieur. We all thought it was pretty funny, with the exception of the one guy that was on a little bit more of some substances than others. There and lost his marbles for a while. He ended up running off in the woods for a few hours but eventually made it back to the house, asking if the world was alright. Good times. My mother was one of those folks that was convinced that everything was going to implode for Y2K. She thought that it would be like a post-apocalyptic nightmare. No food at the stores, banks shut down, people rioting, the whole 9 yards. She desperately tried to convince me, my 2 brothers, and all of our families to come to her place in the country and bunker down for the duration. Of course, none of us were going for that, but we did keep in touch so that she didn't worry too much. I will never forget the phone call where she explained that she had stockpiled canned goods, bought a generator, and bought a milk cow. The cow was so that the kids would have milk since there obviously wouldn't be any at the store. After all, commerce broke down. Monsieur, her heart was in the right place, but really mom, a milk cow. None of the kids were even babies that would need milk. She ended up selling the cow shortly after. Nothing happened. We still laugh about the Y2K milk cow. This one's my favorite. It's wholesome, funny, and slightly nuts. My dad was a systems analyst, working for what was then a major UK high street retailer based in Liverpool, who had their own in-house EPOS system that my dad worked on. His department learned of the Y2K issue at a conference in 94 or 95, and had the system 90% compliant by 1998, but the management were very cautious. Everything was tested and retested and dad was on call throughout December 99, with incredibly generous rates. The office was at the Albert Dock, and dad was called in New Year's Eve as a precaution, so we got to watch the fireworks over the Mersey from the top floor where dad's office was. Dad reckons the extra pay, after tax, amounted to about 6 weeks' pay. I worked in IT at one of the Dow Industrial Company's headquarters, and I spent a high percentage of 1999 doing Y2K tests on every single computer, server, printer, fax machine and, I'm pretty sure, coffee maker. No problems, and no signs of problems that year was a waste of my life. I did the same, minus the Dow Industrial part, checked and certified systems, installed some patches from vendors or in-house teams, rechecked and recertified. By December 1999 we all were really done with it all, only to need to come in on January the 1st, because some upper echelon really wanted some last checks done after the fact. As soon as I stepped into the building lobby, I saw a colleague sitting on one of the benches, clutching their belly and laughing hard, tears in their eyes, pointing at the big digital signage board, wishing everyone a happy new 19,100. Quote, remember all the warnings about how planes will fall from the sky because all the electronics would seize up. In October, my dad finished off the spam he purchased for Y2K. He bought 12 cases of it because it was super cheap leading up to Y2K and he just really enjoys spam. Monsieur, I am honestly impressed at the dedication of someone to eat 288 cans of spam over 20 years. He really dragged that out, didn't he? What do you think he'll do now that his vintage Y2K spam supply is depleted? I am from the rural Midwest. Looking back at my childhood, you would think I grew up in the 1970s and not the 90s because of how country my hometown was. My family didn't really understand Y2K, but they bought into the hype. A lot of religious people were twisting the whole thing into an apocalyptic type of thing. I was a kid and it scared me. I dreaded New Year's Eve, because I was worried that was when the world would end. A few days prior, a low-flying aircraft of some kind flew over the family farm. Monsieur, it was so loud and must have been going fast because there was a sound that may have been a sonic boom. Monsieur, I was outside with my grandpa and I ran inside at the sound, hid under the kitchen table and started bawling. My grandpa fished me out from the table and I told him why I was so scared. He and I rang in the New Year's together to that year so he could show me that everything would be fine. I'm a firefighter and was working on the Y2K night. Right at midnight, all of our primary radio and CAD systems failed. It was a huge, system-wide failure just like everybody predicted would happen. We were getting dispatched by backup radios and our dispatchers were writing down calls on pieces of paper. The suck is that my engine company had the first call of the year, but we didn't get credit for it because of the confusion. When they put calls into the computer after it was fixed, we ended up with call 00013. Duck you engine 3. We were first sincerely, E12. An IT manager was fired somewhere, I guarantee it. We were in high school, had a huge group of friends 30 plus that spent New Year's at one my friend's parents' house. We were doing the countdown. Everyone was nervous from all the hype that computers were not going to be able to calculate the date correctly and revert to 1900, shutting down vital city systems. Internet and computers were just beginning to take over managing everything. For reference, I had a beeper in high school, guys. 5.4.3.2.1. The entire house goes completely dark. Silence. Friend, dad comes upstairs, looks at our scared faces and starts his ass off, slapping his legs and doubling over with humor. Can't catch his breath. He flipped the breaker. Lights back, come on. Happy Y2K everyone. It was perfect. I got up at 3 a.m. to check if the world had ended. It had not, so I went back to bed. My dad had been paid quite a bit over the previous year, as he was a COBOL programmer 20 to 30 years before, and it was mostly COBOL programs that people worried about. The panic helped increase his wage. A lot of stuff did end up getting fixed, which is why things didn't go as badly as predicted. He didn't work at all this century. Part of it was that he had made enough that he could stop working, but I think a large part was that he developed an inflated sense of what his skills were worth over those few years, and has never been offered anything close since. New Year's Eve itself I had a very bad cold. I spent most of the night huddled in my bed. At midnight I went across the street for half an hour. Some friends had gotten the key to the roof of the engineering building, the Wahlberg building, and we went up there to watch the fireworks. The The stuff written later is mostly good until 2038, but the Cobalt stuff, long forgotten, long unmaintained, written when 2000 was further away than the dawn of computing as the authors knew it, proprietary fixed-length formats everywhere, that's the scary stuff. Also, don't panic about 2038, some things will break, but people are generally aware of the problem now, and software life cycles have gotten shorter. Do use 2038 safe formats though, it's closer than 2000. COBOL now there is a name I haven't heard in a long time. I was 8 during the Y2K craze, growing up in a small town, about 5,000 people, on the east coast of the USA where most of the people were very religious and scared of technology. At that time only a few households in my neighborhood had a computer but only 1 or 2 had the internet. My parents and I spent night at our next door neighbor's house. They had the internet and were avid hunters who had gone through the hassle of getting extra food and supplies just in case. My neighbors had 2 teenage boys. We were gathered in their basement to watch the ball drop on TV, and right at the stroke of midnight one of the teenage boys snuck over to the circuit breaker and cut the power for the house. The next minute or so was just sheer panic from the adults. I just sat there not fully understanding what was going on. Of course they had flashlights on hand and the teenager who cut the power was quickly found sitting underneath the circuit breaker giggling like a little girl. The giggles quickly turned to fear as his parents started shrieking at him and giving him a whopping. OMG, that is awesome. Did he say it was worth it? I would have thought it was worth it. I was 10 years old and spent the night at my grandparents' house. My grandparents had stockpiled food just in case but weren't tripping much beyond that. Once it hit midnight, I watched as nothing happened to my digital watch. Then we looked outside, saw our normal fireworks, and on TV everyone at the ball drop was like, okay cool, so we good. This was basically my experience, though it is a good idea to have a few weeks of food around. Natural disasters are a thing after all. Not really a good story, or a story, really, but I used to read the hip-hop magazine, The Source, and I remember they had an issue on Y2G, as they called it, Year 2 Grand, I guess. It was pretty cringy. It had Jay-Z in some weird, metallic, futuristic clothing and some backup dancers with spiky hair on the cover. Alberta, Canada. My dad worked for the provincial government and was assigned to Alberta Environment's Y2K Rapid Response Team. Monsieur, if the Millennium Bug caused anything in the oil fields to go boom, Dad would have to supervise cleanup efforts. January 1st, 2000, at around 1:30 a.m., Dad got the call. Yeah, everything's fine. Rapid Response Team is being disbanded. Go back to bed and enjoy your day off. Lived in a house in the middle of the boonies with my friends shortly after high school. This house was owned by a survivalist software engineer who said we could live there rent-free on the condition that we all go through survivalist training by a high-ranking Marine officer at his own expense. This was him initiating a small group of go-getters who would help him recreate society after the apocalypse, which was inevitably coming, most likely with a Y2K societal collapse. I learned how to navigate and triangulate with and without map and compass, lead a group of civilian soldiers, and shoot a Colt 45. By the end of training, I could assemble and disassemble it in a minute and 7 seconds blindfolded. The peak of our training was when my best friend and I, both female, took down a line of cans at 30 yards from the outside in, one starting on the left and the other starting on the right, in complete tandem, hitting the middle one simultaneously. The man who trained us was gushing with pride that day. New Year's came around. We sat by the fire, took some acid and contemplated what was next for our lives. I grew up in rural Tennessee, and my neighbors at the end of the road were a legit militia. They had built a bunch of bunkers and stockpiled food and fuel and weapons, and went out in the woods on training exercises. Through the Clinton administration, they were mostly preparing for a new world order, black helicopter, Hillary Clinton takeover type scenario, but Y2K really meshed with their worldview. They offered to let my neighbor, a machinist and welder, join their crew, but I guess they didn't have much use for my family. In October, we got a misdelivered Xerox newsletter in the mail. It was totally creepy, full of helpful tips for setting up your own little warlorddom after Y2K, how to subjugate the Population. Set up roadblocks around your fiefdom, getting the most out of your serfs once civilization fell. Building alliances with your neighboring warlords. My machinist neighbor, who always had some shady characters hanging around his place, told the militia he'd be fine and went and bought a ducking machine gun. After New Year's, we didn't see the militia much. Their leader died a few months later, which was really a shame, because 9/11 would have been right up his alley. I'm not gonna lie, that sounds badass. You're ready for Red Dawn now, Wolverines.